Hello, and welcome back to Forgotten Ties. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of a deception so deep, so fundamentally woven into the fabric of a young man's life, that it will make you question the very nature of family, of love, and of the secrets we keep hidden in plain sight. This isn't a story of a distant ancestor or a forgotten inheritance. This is a story that unfolded in the present, in the quiet, unassuming town of Northwood, where one man's entire reality was built on a lie, a beautiful, agonizing lie embodied by the one person he thought he knew best, his foster sister. Meet Elias Vance, a name you might forget, but a face, a gentle, almost perpetually sad face with eyes the color of storm clouds, that you wouldn't. Elias was 28, working as a draftsman, a meticulous profession for a meticulous mind. His life, by all outward appearances, was stable, if a little solitary. But his world revolved around one person, a shining, captivating presence that had been his anchor since childhood. Seraphina. Seraphina wasn't his biological sister, not by blood, but by bond. A bond forged in the crucible of the foster care system and solidified in the warm, if slightly strained, home of the Vances. They came to the Vances at different times. Elias was 9, a solemn, quiet boy whose parents had tragically perished in a boating accident off the coast of Maine. His grief was a silent companion. 2 years later, when Elias was 11, Seraphina arrived. She was 9, a whirlwind of fiery red hair that cascaded to her waist, a riot of freckles across the bridge of her nose, and an irrepressible laugh that sounded like wind chimes. Her story was less final, more complex. A mother who was present but profoundly absent, struggling with addiction and instability. The Vances, George and Eleanor, were good people, kind, perhaps a little too reserved, but they offered a sanctuary, a structured silence that both children needed. Elias, the reserved storm cloud, and Seraphina, the dazzling, unpredictable sunbeam, formed an immediate, intense connection. They were two halves of an equation they hadn't known was incomplete. As they grew up, that sibling bond deepened, evolving into something subtly different, something more charged, more electric. Seraphina was his muse, his confidant, the keeper of his darkest fears. Elias was her protector, her grounding force, the only constant in a life that had started with such terrifying unpredictability. They went to the same college. Elias, the practical engineer, Seraphina, the dreamer studying literature, who often joked that she was searching for the romantic tragedy of their shared history within the pages of dusty novels. They lived in the same city. They shared holidays, birthdays, the quiet, mundane moments that build a life. But there was always an unspoken boundary, a careful, almost painful maintenance of the brother and sister facade. A line they both skirted, acknowledging the magnetic pull while meticulously avoiding the devastating collision. The tipping point arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper, a casual, almost insignificant remark at a crowded family reunion held at the Vances' home. It was George Vance's 70th birthday. The air was thick with the smell of barbecue and the clamor of distant relatives. Elias was leaning against the porch railing, watching Seraphina, now 26, her red hair a darker, richer hue, her laugh still pure music, gently arguing with Eleanor about the merits of a new literary release. George, Elias's foster father, approached him, a quiet, contemplative man whose usual silence often masked a profound depth of feeling. He cleared his throat. "Elias," he began, his voice gravelly, "you know, I've always regretted not knowing more about your side of the family. The Vances are simple folk. Your parents, the Van Dykes, well, they were from a different world, weren't they?" Elias nodded, a familiar, deep-seated ache surfacing. He knew almost nothing. His memories were fragmented, his file thin. George sighed, a heavy sound. "I remember when we first met Eleanor's cousin way back. It was at a wedding in upstate New York. A fiery little woman, a real spitfire. Her name was Lila Sterling. She was married to a man who looked like he belonged on a fishing boat, all weathered and quiet. Sounded a lot like your father, actually. Same town, too, I think. Odd thing is, they had a daughter around your age, maybe a little younger. A girl with that unmistakable red hair. Elias's meticulous mind, the one that drafted blueprints with agonizing precision, suddenly stalled. The name, Lila Sterling, hit a strange, discordant note. He'd heard that name before, buried deep in Seraphina's initial, incomplete foster file. A forgotten aunt, a brief mention, dismissed as irrelevant since her mother was the one signing away parental rights. The coincidence was too jarring. Lila Sterling, Eleanor's cousin, married to a man who resembled Elias's father, from the same small, coastal town of Newburyport, Maine, and having a daughter with Seraphina's distinctive fiery hair. The meticulous silence of the afternoon seemed to amplify the growing, deafening suspicion in his mind. He turned to George, his voice a strained whisper. "George, what was the name of Eleanor's aunt?" "Lila's mother's sister." George frowned, rubbing his chin. "Oh, that old bat? Let's see. Agnes. Agnes Van Dyke. She married into that old Dutch family. The Van Dykes. Yes, I remember now, that was Lila's connection to Eleanor. Lila's mother and Eleanor's father were siblings. Eleanor's side always joked about the two families, the quiet Van Cess and the artistic, fiery Van Dykes. The world tilted. Agnes Van Dyke, Elias's mother's maiden name, a detail he had only learned from his scant documentation. It was a common enough name, maybe, but coupled with the town, the timing, the shared foster mother's family connection, and the distinctive physical trait of that impossible hair, it was no longer a coincidence. It was a pattern, a structure that suddenly, terrifyingly, snapped into focus. The truth, or the horrifying possibility of it, slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. Seraphina, his Seraphina, the girl he loved, the girl he was trying so desperately not to love in that forbidden, aching way, was not just his foster sister. She was connected to his biological family. She wasn't just a beautiful stranger who landed in his life. She might be family, by blood, not just by bond. But the question remained, how closely related? And why had no one ever mentioned this intricate, almost impossible web of familial connections that linked his lost history directly to the present reality of Seraphina's arrival in their home? The silence of the Van Cess, once a comfort, now felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket of complicity. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this single, casually dropped piece of information was the first thread he would pull, and the unraveling of that thread would destroy everything he held dear. The game for Elias Vance had just changed, and the stakes were impossibly high. Elias's head was spinning. The taste of charcoal and sweet birthday cake turned to ash in his mouth. He excused himself from the reunion chaos, the cacophony of cheerful voices and clinking glasses, a sudden, violent offense to the spiraling dread in his mind. He needed silence, he needed order, the very thing his world was rapidly losing. He retreated to the small, dusty home office George used, a room filled with archaic tax files and the scent of old paper. He closed the door, muffling the festive noise outside, leaving him alone with the impossible equation George Vance had just presented him with. Agnes Van Dyke, Lila Sterling, Eleanor's cousin, Seraphina, the Van Dykes. That surname, Elias knew from his paperwork, was not just his mother's maiden name. It was a name attached to a specific, almost mythical family history. A wealthy, eccentric Dutch-American family who'd made their fortune in New England shipping centuries ago. His parents, he'd been told, were the black sheep branch, the ones who chose adventure over inheritance, tragically cutting their lineage short. Now, Seraphina, the girl he'd spent the last 17 years of his life loving in a way that defied the title of sister, was connected to that same deep, buried root. Elias began to obsessively piece together the fragments. He couldn't ask George directly. The old man's casual revelation seemed accidental, perhaps even innocent. The kind of accidental slip that only happens when a secret has been carefully maintained for decades. He had to be stealthy. His draftsman's precision kicked in, turning a matter of the heart into a cold, hard case to be solved. The first step was the files. Seraphina's initial foster care documents were stored in the Van Cess basement, tucked away in a plastic bin labeled Old School Records. He remembered seeing them years ago, thin and unremarkable. Now they were his holy grail. Waiting until late that night, long after the last of the guests had left and the Vances were asleep, Elias crept down to the damp, musty basement. The air was heavy, the silence broken only by the hum of the furnace, a silence that magnified the frantic thumping in his chest. He found the bin and pulled out Seraphina's file. The pages were yellowed, brittle, filled with the formal, detached language of bureaucracy. He scanned past the standard evaluations, the doctor's reports, until he reached the intake forms detailing her biological mother, Clarissa Clara Sterling. And there it was, in faded ink, the name of Clara's sister, the only known relative listed who wasn't involved in the custody battle. Lila Sterling. The Lila Sterling George had just mentioned. The woman married to a man who looked like his father. This confirmed the direct link to the Sterling side, which was the connection to Eleanor Vance's family. The Vances weren't just random foster parents. They were distantly related to Seraphina's mother. But the real connection, the one that chilled him to the bone, was through the Van Dykes. He retrieved his own, much thinner file from a separate box. His mother's name, Victoria Van Dyke Vance, her married name. He flipped to the section on her immediate family. Her father's sister, listed as deceased, was Agnes Van Dyke. Agnes Van Dyke, the old bat George had mentioned, the one who connected the Van Dykes to the Sterling family line through marriage or kinship. He drew a quick, frantic family tree on a scrap of graph paper. It was a dizzying, terrifying web. Elias's side, the Van Dykes Victoria Van Dyke $/ $, Agnes Van Dyke, sister. Seraphina's side, the Sterlings Clarissa Sterling $/ $, Lila Sterling, sister. The nexus. George said Lila Sterling was Eleanor's cousin. George also said Lila's mother was Agnes Van Dyke. The implications were catastrophic. If Agnes Van Dyke was Victoria Van Dyke's sister, Elias's mother's sister, and Agnes was the mother of Lila Sterling, Seraphina's aunt, then it meant Elias's mother, Victoria, and Seraphina's grandmother, Agnes, would be sisters. Wait, no. George had said Agnes Van Dyke was Lila's mother's sister, not Lila's mother. He reread George's words in his mind, trying to recall the exact, casual phrasing. Lila's mother and Eleanor's father were siblings, Agnes Van Dyke. That was Lila's connection to Eleanor. The connection was confusingly convoluted, but one fact remained horrifyingly clear. The Van Dyke name, his mother's name, was deeply intertwined with Seraphina's maternal lineage. He needed one last, irrefutable piece of evidence. The only person who might hold the full, uncut truth, the one who stood at the precise intersection of all these families, was Eleanor Vance. The next morning, the house was quiet. Eleanor, a woman of meticulous routine, was watering her prize-winning orchids in the sunroom. She was a woman who guarded her secrets in the same way she tended her flowers, with quiet, fierce vigilance. Elias approached her, his voice carefully neutral, almost clinical. "Eleanor, can I ask you about the reunion yesterday?" She paused, clipping a dead leaf with a silver shear. Her silver hair, usually pulled back in a severe bun, softened slightly in the morning light. "Of course, dear. Did you enjoy George's party?" "I did. George mentioned your cousin, Lila Sterling. It got me thinking about family history. You know how little I know about my mother's side, the Van Dykes." He paused, letting the names hang in the air, watching her reaction. Eleanor's hand, holding the shears, trembled almost imperceptibly. She didn't look at him. The Van Dykes were always complicated. A whole lot of drama and money. George exaggerates, Elias. Family history is often just gossip. "Maybe," Elias pressed gently, "but I found something in an old box. My mother's maiden name was Van Dyke, and when Seraphina came to us, I remember her initial file mentioned an Aunt Lila Sterling. It seems impossible that these two families, from the same town of Newburyport, connected by the same rare Dutch surname, would both end up on our doorstep." Eleanor finally turned. Her eyes, usually a soft, forget-me-not blue, were now sharp, distant, and filled with a pain he'd never seen before. The placid surface of her life had been shattered. "It wasn't an accident, Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the trickle of the watering can. "It was never an accident. Seraphina, she was placed with us. Not because we were the next available foster home, but because of me." He leaned in, his own breath catching. "Because of you? What does that mean, Eleanor?" She set the watering can down with a definitive clank that echoed the finality of her words. "It means Seraphina's biological mother, Clara Sterling, was my niece, my sister's daughter. Seraphina's mother and I shared a father. We kept it quiet because of George's sister's involvement with the Social Services Board. We wanted Seraphina safe and away from her unstable mother, but we couldn't reveal the true family connection without raising too many questions, especially about the Van Dykes." Elias took a shaky step back. This was the first seismic shift in the truth. Seraphina wasn't just distantly related to his foster parents. She was Eleanor's niece. That was a shocking secret, but it still didn't explain the Van Dyke connection. "But the Van Dykes, Eleanor. My mother, Victoria Van Dyke. How does my family fit into your sister's daughter's life?" he demanded, his composure finally cracking. Eleanor closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the fine wrinkles near her temple. "Oh, Elias, that is the part that George and I promised never to speak of. It's the original sin, the thing that connects you and Seraphina in a way that is far more terrifying, far more intimate than foster siblings. The Van Dykes had a very distinct family trait, Elias. They were known for that striking red hair. Your father, bless his soul, he was the one who was truly terrified of the discovery. He knew. He realized it the moment Seraphina walked through the door. The silence that followed was suffocating. His mind raced. The distinct red hair, his father's fear, the terrifying intimacy. The meticulous world of Elias Vance was not just unraveling. It was being meticulously, violently reconstructed into a shape he couldn't bear to recognize. The next turn in this twisted family history would reveal the true, agonizing nature of his bond with Seraphina, a revelation that lay just beyond the precipice of Eleanor's next, hesitant words. The truth hung suspended between Elias and Eleanor, heavy and toxic like stale smoke. Eleanor, with her eyes still closed, had opened the door revealing the hell of the past, but she hadn't let Elias walk through it yet. He gripped her shoulders, feeling the tremor beneath her thin cardigan. He was no longer the 9-year-old adopted boy. He was a 28-year-old man, standing on the precipice where his fateful connection to Seraphina was forged. "Tell me, Eleanor." His voice was hoarse, a mix of demand and plea. "What is that terrifying intimacy? What did my father know? Why do you talk about the red hair? What is the secret that both George and my father had to bury?" Eleanor opened her eyes, staring at the orchids as if they held the answers she dared not voice. "After our biological son passed away, George and Robert became close that year. Robert was his fishing buddy. Your father, Robert Van Dyke Vance. He was the one who found us, Elias. He chose us to be your foster parents." She took a deep, protracted breath, as if about to dive into the abyss of memory. Then, 2 years later, Seraphina arrived. That vivid, unmistakable red hair. She was 9 years old. George and I recognized, based on the loose connection to the Sterlings through my side, that there was a bizarre coincidence, but your father, Robert, he didn't see it that way. He saw a reflection. "A reflection of what?" Elias pressed. "A reflection of Agnes Van Dyke," Eleanor whispered. "Agnes was your mother Victoria's sister. Victoria and Robert had cut ties with the Van Dykes, the wealthy, old-fashioned ones. But Agnes, she had a different life. She didn't marry a Van Dyke, but she was a Van Dyke. Like your mother, she stood out with that striking red hair, a very rare and dominant trait. Robert, he told George a horrifying story. And then, Eleanor brought forth the truth, a slow, agonizing confession, each word like a knife tearing at the veil of reality. Agnes Van Dyke and Lila Sterling. Lila is my niece, my sister's daughter, yes. But Lila had a sister, Clara Sterling, Seraphina's mother. Robert knew Agnes. He had encountered her many times at Van Dyke gatherings before marrying Victoria. When he saw Seraphina, he suddenly remembered a family gathering just before he married Victoria. One night, a blizzard night in Newburyport years ago, Robert and Agnes, they had a drunken night together. Once, a terrible mistake, before he married your mother. Elias stumbled back. His mind tried to deny the words, seeking a logical loophole, but the meticulous structure he had built crumbled to dust. No, that can't be it, he stammered. If Agnes was the Van Dyke and she, then what? Eleanor shook her head, tears finally starting to fall. Agnes later married, gave birth to Lila, but never had a child with her husband Sterling. But Clara Sterling, Seraphina's mother, is my sister's daughter. The truth Robert remembered was this. Agnes had a sister, a cousin, or another relative, a woman who also had that unmistakable Van Dyke red hair, who became pregnant by Robert before he married your mother. It was a mistake, a secret he tried to bury by marrying Victoria and moving to Maine. But it didn't stop there. Eleanor put her hands over her face. Also in Newburyport, Maine, where your parents had their boating accident, Robert had another life before Victoria. A hidden college romance. A woman with that Van Dyke red hair. That woman gave birth to a daughter before Robert met Victoria. He paid her off, kept it hidden, and thought it was over. That woman wasn't Clara Sterling, but another, also a member of the Van Dyke lineage. When Seraphina came to our house with that fiery red hair and the Sterling name, Robert made the connection, but not in the way you think. So, my father, my biological father and Seraphina's biological father, are the same man, Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide with horror. Robert Van Dyke Vance. Your biological father and Seraphina's are one person. Elias's world was cleaved in two. He and Seraphina were not just distant cousins, not foster siblings with a forbidden attraction. They were half-siblings. Seraphina was not Eleanor's niece. She was the daughter of George's friend's daughter, whom Robert had hidden the college romance with. She was brought to the Vance household not because of loose kinship, but because Robert, his father, had arranged it from Maine, a desperate, dying effort to keep both his biological children under one roof when he was no longer there to protect them. Robert had leveraged Eleanor's connection to the Sterling side as cover. That was why Seraphina's file was patchy, obfuscated. That was why Robert, his father, while alive, had been so obsessed with keeping Seraphina close. This ultimate truth, that his father was not a victim but a perpetrator, who wove this web of deception to control his children's destiny even after he was dead, was truly the apex of tragedy. It didn't just strip away the father he loved and respected, but it stripped away the love of his life, turning it into something abhorrent, an indelible primal sin. He stumbled back, hitting the desk and knocking over a stack of old books. The noise woke George, who rushed down. What is it? Eleanor? George saw Elias, his face pale and contorted with shock, and then Eleanor, who was shaking and tearful. He knew the truth had been exposed. You knew, Elias said, his voice no longer a whisper but a guttural, painful roar. You knew all of it. You knew Robert was the biological father of both of us. You let me love her, grow up next to her, without saying a word. George collapsed onto a nearby chair, a broken old man. We swore an oath to Robert. He was dying, Elias. He begged us. Seraphina had been abandoned. He said she was his daughter, the result of an old mistake in Newburyport before he married your mother. He believed that if she was fostered under the name Seraphina Sterling, she would be safe. And you needed a family too. Robert believed the bond of foster siblings would protect both of you from the truth. It was his last arrangement to atone for the mistakes of his life. This final truth, that his father was not a victim but a perpetrator, who wove this web of deception to control his children's destiny even after he was dead, was truly the apex of tragedy. It didn't just strip away the father he loved and respected, but it stripped away the love of his life, turning it into something abhorrent, an indelible primal sin. The meticulous world of Elias Vance was not just unraveling. It was being meticulously, violently reconstructed into a shape he couldn't bear to recognize. The next turn in this twisted family history would reveal the true, agonizing nature of his bond with Seraphina, a revelation that lay just beyond the precipice of Eleanor's next, hesitant words. He knew he had to face her with this raw, agonizing truth. The truth was out, and it did not free Elias. It bound him in a new, agonizing chain. George and Eleanor's quiet room now held 3 shattered souls, buried under the weight of a 2-decade-old secret. George, the man who kept his oath to his deceased friend, could only hang his head in shame. Eleanor, torn between her custodial duty and the brutal fact, wept relentlessly. But Elias's fury, grief, and despair were the most potent. He was once a draftsman, a man who created order from chaos. Now, his life was a torn blueprint, and every line led back to Seraphina. He left the house, stepping out into the bright sunshine where Seraphina sat on the old swing set, reading, her red hair blazing like an unquenchable fire, an undeniable marker of the Van Dyke blood that ran in both of them. She looked up as he approached, her smile bright, innocent. That smile used to be his light. Now it was an accusation. "There you are," she said, her voice the only sedative in his storm. "Everyone's looking for you. What is it, Elias? You look like you've seen a ghost." A ghost. His father's ghost. The ghost of the truth. Elias sat down on the swing next to her, the cold wooden plank beneath his rear. He looked into her emerald eyes he drowned in his whole life, now seeing a new, horrifying familiarity. "Seraphina," he began, his voice foreign to himself, rough and fragmented. He couldn't lie to her. He couldn't continue this charade. The false intimacy of the foster-sibling relationship was over. "I need you to hear me out without interrupting until I'm finished. This is the only thing that matters," he told her. He began with George's story about the Van Dykes, about Lila Sterling. He delved into the dusty files in the basement, the linking of his mother's surname to her maternal lineage. He described his confrontation with Eleanor, her voice trembling as she revealed Seraphina was deliberately placed with them. And then, he came to the climax, the devastating truth that George and Robert had buried. He spoke of Newburyport, of his father's arrangement, Robert Van Dyke Vance. When he uttered the last words, "Our biological father is the same man, Robert Van Dyke Vance," she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just became utterly, coldly still. Her book slipped from her hands, falling into the grass. Her face, usually expressive as a painting, was blank. Seraphina's silence was more devastating than any emotional storm. It took a long time for her to speak. "No, can't be. You're saying that our foster-sibling bond wasn't a lie, but a truth. But that way?" Her voice was just a sigh. "All these years, all these feelings, these boundaries we tried so hard to maintain, it was all for nothing. Not because it was taboo, but because it was incest. A desperate, insane arrangement by a man who wanted to control us." Seraphina was no fool. She was a student of literature who understood tragedy. She instantly grasped the full scope of the betrayal, not from Elias, but from the adults around them, especially the father she never knew and the foster father she trusted. She had always searched for romantic tragedy in novels. Now, she was thrust into the center of a Greek family tragedy, written in blood. "You loved me, Elias?" she said, not as a question, but as an accusation, her voice thick with pain. Elias couldn't look at her. "I always loved you, Seraphina. That's why I had to stay away. I tried to maintain the foster-sibling line, tried to fight that undeniable feeling. But it was all just a cruel joke of fate, a familiarity pre-written, because we were born of the same man." In that moment, the truth was no longer a secret of the adults. It became their living burden. Seraphina stood up, her hair falling forward, obscuring her face. She wasn't angry. She was empty. "I have to leave, Elias. I have to get away from this house. Away from the Vance name. Away from the Van Dyke threads. Away from all these lies." In the weeks and months that followed, their story became a painful separation, more tragic than any breakup. Seraphina left Northwood. She didn't say where she was going, only that she needed a place free of the shadow of Robert Van Dyke Vance, free of the half-brother who had loved her. Elias respected her choice, understanding that his presence was a constant reminder of the cursed nature of their bond. He stayed in Northwood, but not in the Vance house. He couldn't. He moved to a small apartment in the city, where he continued his work as a draftsman, trying to find order again in the straight lines of his life. The Vance family was broken. George and Eleanor were left with their silence and regret, the burden of the secret finally crushing them. Elias Vance, the man who realized his foster sister was his cousin, and ultimately his half-sister all along, had learned a terrible lesson. Not all connections are destiny. Some are tragic traps set by the secrets of a generation before. Their love wasn't wrong because they were foster siblings. It was wrong because they were blood family, and that truth had ruined both their lives. The unbreakable bond they felt turned out to be the chains of forgotten ties. Connections that were lost, buried, yet returned to demand a terrible price. And this, viewers, is where the story of Elias and Seraphina ends, for now. A chilling reminder that sometimes, the truth about our family is the most tragic and devastating thing of all. If this twisted story of family secrets, the betrayal of blood, and cursed connections resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with those you think would appreciate the raw truth. Don't forget to subscribe to the Forgotten Ties channel so you don't miss any more stories of secrets buried in the dark. And most importantly, hit that notification bell icon so you are always the first to know when we uncover the next secret. Thank you for watching. See you next time.